Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. I am genuinely fired up about today's story because it is one of those quiet earthquakes that reshapes the entire competitive map of the AI industry almost overnight.
That is a big claim to open with, so let's ground it for everybody. We are talking about Microsoft's Build conference this week, and a whole batch of brand new models.
Exactly right. At Build 2026, Microsoft pulled the curtain back on 7 in-house MI models. And the headliner is something they are calling MAI Thinking One, their very first homegrown reasoning model.
Okay, so for the people who have been hearing the name Microsoft and the name OpenAI used almost interchangeably for years now, why is a Microsoft-built reasoning model actually a surprising development?
Because for years, Microsoft's entire frontier AI story ran straight through OpenAI. The Copilot you use, the smart features in Office, the Azure AI services, almost all of it leaned on OpenAI's models underneath.
Right, Microsoft was the megaphone, and OpenAI was effectively the voice. So when you tell me Microsoft trained its own reasoning model from scratch, that sounds like the megaphone deciding it wants its own voice too.
That is a perfect way to frame it. And the detail that makes engineers raise their eyebrows is this. MAI Thinking One was trained without any OpenAI data. No distillation, no borrowing from the GPT series at all.
Hold on, let's unpack distillation for a second, because I think a lot of listeners hear that word and their eyes glaze over. But it is actually central to why this matters so much.
Sure, so distillation is essentially having a smaller student model learn by imitating the outputs of a bigger, smarter teacher model. A lot of newer models quietly bootstrap their intelligence by studying a stronger rival.
And the accusation that floats around the whole industry is that half the new models are secretly students of OpenAI or one of the other giants, learning from their homework rather than doing it themselves.
Precisely, which is why Microsoft is making such a loud point of saying this one was built from scratch on commercially licensed enterprise data, with no third-party models feeding it the answers behind the scenes.
So this is partly a technical achievement and partly a legal and strategic statement. They want to be able to say, hand on heart, that this model is clean, owned, and entirely theirs.
Yes, and the strategic subtext is enormous. If your supplier is also turning into your competitor, which is exactly what OpenAI has become, then owning your own frontier capability is no longer a luxury. It is survival.
Let's talk about the actual machine for a moment, because I want to know whether this is a serious contender or just a flag-planting exercise. What is under the hood of an MAI Thinking One?
It is a sparse mixture of experts model, and the numbers are genuinely respectable. Roughly 35 billion active parameters, around 1 trillion total parameters, and a context window of 256,000 tokens.
Okay, mixture of experts is another one of those phrases that gets thrown around constantly. So help the audience picture what it actually means when you say 35 billion active out of a trillion total.
Think of it like a giant hospital full of specialists. The whole building holds 1 trillion parameters worth of expertise, but for any single question, only the relevant specialists, about 35 billion, actually wake up and work.
So you get the breadth of a massive model, but you only pay the compute bill for the slice you actually use on each query. That is a clever way to keep costs down at scale.
That is exactly the economic magic of it, and cost is a huge part of this whole announcement. Microsoft is explicitly pitching these models as a way to lower expenses for developers building on their platform.
Let's get to the part everyone secretly cares about, which is the benchmarks, because a model is only as impressive as the scores it can defend. What did Microsoft put on the scoreboard here?
They led with mathematics, and the headline figures are striking. MAI Thinking One reportedly hit 97% on the AIME 2025 exam and 94.5% on the 2026 version.
For context, AIME is a famously brutal competition math exam, the kind that filters for genuine multi-step reasoning, not memorization. Scoring in the 90s, there is not something you fake with a shallow model.
Completely agreed, and then they went straight for the coding crown. On the SWE Bench Pro Software Engineering Benchmark, Microsoft claims MAI Thinking One actually matches Claude Opus 4.6, which is a serious frontier rival.
Now I have to put on my skeptic hat, because vendor-reported benchmarks are basically the model equivalent of a restaurant reviewing its own food. How much salt should we be taking with these numbers exactly?
A healthy pinch, absolutely, but here's the wrinkle that caught my attention. Microsoft also ran blind side-by-side human evaluations through Surge, an independent rating partner comparing their model against established competitors head-to-head.
And blind human preference testing is a meaningfully harder thing to game than a static benchmark, because real people are reacting to real answers without knowing which lab produced which response. So, what was the verdict there?
In those blind comparisons, human raters actually preferred MAI Thinking One over Claude Sonnet 4.6. Now, that is not the very top of Anthropic's lineup, but being preferred over any Claude model is a statement.
It really is, especially for a first-generation in-house model. Usually a company's debut frontier attempt is charmingly mediocre, the kind of thing you politely call promising. Beating a shipping Claude model out of the gate is different.
And do not overlook the smaller sibling in this lineup, because in some ways, it might matter more day to day. MAI Code 1 Flash is a 5 billion parameter coding model rolling out across all GitHub Copilot plans.
That is the move that actually touches millions of developers immediately, because Copilot is everywhere. Putting a Microsoft-owned model directly inside the tool that writes code alongside engineers is distribution at a scale almost nobody else has.
Exactly, and it is a beautifully efficient flywheel. Every developer interaction with that Copilot model generates signal Microsoft can learn from, all running on their own infrastructure with none of it routed through an external supplier anymore.
Let's zoom out to the relationship that hangs over all of this, because you cannot tell this story without talking about the strange marriage between Microsoft and OpenAI that has defined the last several years of AI.
It really has become one of the most fascinating frenemy relationships in business history. Microsoft poured billions into OpenAI, got deep access to its models, and built an empire of products on top of that partnership.
But then OpenAI started shipping its own consumer products, its own enterprise deals, even its own infrastructure ambitions, and suddenly the partner that powered your products is competing for the very same customers you are chasing.
And that is the precise tension MAI Thinking One is designed to relieve. Microsoft is not necessarily trying to dump OpenAI tomorrow, but it desperately wants what executives keep calling optionality, the freedom to swap models underneath.
They actually built tooling around exactly that idea, right? I saw mention of something called the Foundry Control Plane, which sounds like a fancy name for a switchboard that lets you change models on demand.
That is essentially what it is, a control layer that lets developers route their applications to whichever model makes sense. Whether that is a Microsoft model, an OpenAI model, an Anthropic model, or something else entirely.
So the deeper strategy is not just one new model. It is turning AI models into something closer to interchangeable commodities, where Microsoft owns the marketplace and the plumbing rather than betting everything on a single supplier.
Yes, and that is genuinely threatening to the pure model labs, because if models become swappable parts, then the value migrates to whoever controls distribution, tooling, and the customer relationship, which is precisely where Microsoft is strongest.
There is also a quieter angle here that I think deserves attention, which is the claim that this whole thing was trained on commercially licensed enterprise data, rather than the usual scraped pile from the open internet.
That detail is doing enormous work, because the entire industry is currently swimming in copyright lawsuits over training data. And a model built on properly licensed material is a much easier thing for cautious enterprises to adopt.
So a regulated bank or a hospital that has been nervous about where a model's knowledge actually came from suddenly has a frontier-grade option with a cleaner paper trail behind exactly how it was built.
Precisely, and that provenance story could end up being just as valuable as the benchmark scores. Because in the enterprise world, trust and defensibility often matter more than squeezing out the last percentage point of raw capability.
It also lands at a fascinating moment for OpenAI specifically, given everything swirling around their finances and their ambitions. And a credible Microsoft alternative changes the negotiating leverage between those two companies in a pretty profound way.
It absolutely does, because the implicit threat is now real rather than theoretical. Microsoft can sit at the table and quietly remind everyone that it no longer has to accept any terms since it can build its own.
Let me push back from the other direction, though, because I do not want us to crown Microsoft prematurely. Training one good model is very different from sustaining a frontier research program year after expensive year.
That is a fair and important caution. The frontier labs have spent years building research cultures, talent density, and training infrastructure. One impressive launch does not prove Microsoft can keep pace as the frontier keeps sprinting forward.
And there is the awkward question of all that money already invested in OpenAI. You cannot exactly tell your investors you spent billions on a partner and then quietly built the thing you were paying them for.
Right. Although Microsoft would probably argue that owning both the partnership and the in house capability is the smartest possible position, because it hedges every scenario, whether OpenAI thrives, stumbles, or drifts further into direct competition with them.
When you put it that way, it is almost less about beating OpenAI and more about never again being in a position where any single outside lab can hold your entire product roadmap hostage with their pricing.
That is the heart of it, and honestly, that lesson applies far beyond Microsoft. Every large enterprise leaning entirely on one AI provider should be watching this and asking whether they too need a credible fallback plan.
So if you are a developer or a technology leader listening right now, what is the practical takeaway you should actually walk away with from this whole Microsoft Build announcement, beyond just the impressive benchmark bragging rights?
The takeaway is that the era of assuming one model vendor rules everything is ending, and you should architect your systems for choice. Build with abstraction layers so you can swap models as economics and quality shift.
And keep an eye on price, because the unspoken weapon in all of this is cost. If Microsoft can deliver near-frontier quality at a meaningfully lower price, that pressure ripples across every competitor's pricing very quickly.
Absolutely. Competition on cost is the gift to everybody who actually builds with these tools. And a model that matches the leaders while running cheaper inside the platforms you already use is a remarkably compelling proposition.
Before we wrap, give me your honest gut read. Is MAI Thinking One a genuine inflection point in the AI competitive landscape? Or is it a strong opening move that still has everything left to prove?
My honest read is that it is a genuine inflection point in intent, even if the technical lead proves temporary. Microsoft has declared it will own its AI destiny, and a company that size declaring that changes everything.
That is a perfect note to land on, because the models will keep leapfrogging each other, but the strategic decision to stop renting your intelligence and start owning it is the kind of shift that compounds for years.
Beautifully said. And I think a year from now, we will look back at this build as the moment the cozy Microsoft and OpenAI story officially became a much more complicated and competitive multi-model reality for everyone.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.